Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I am very excited to be joined by the celebrated author, Lisa Colón DeLay. Lisa loves spiritual formation, loves it so much that she's working to change it because, according to her, it's missing something critical. Think about it. While Jesus was a poor, marginalized man with a tenderness for society's outcast, most of the leading voices in spirituality today come from people of privilege. How does this impact our spiritual growth? Like, what are we missing? Today, we'll have a conversation about decentering whiteness, trauma-informed spiritual practice, embodied healing, and what happens when we remember that Christianity started as an Eastern religion, all while we explore our inner landscapes. Lisa Colón DeLay is a Puerto Rican author of the spiritual formation book called The Wild Land Within. She is a teacher, spiritual companion, and podcast host of a popular show called Spark My Muse. Her work focuses on enriching invaluable spaces within each person and the spaces and ways that we connect for healing our relationships, families, communities, and the world at large. Lisa, we are delighted to have you here today. Welcome.
It's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. To start us off today, I just wanted to ask how, in a few sentences, perhaps, you would describe your spirituality today.
I would describe it as contemplative, Christian, and also probably not anything like the God I grew up with, because I was a pastor's kid. And so I was taught a very specific kind of doctrine, a very specific kind of God, a very colonized God, I would say. And I've learned a lot about practicing the presence of God and God being with me in every moment, which is actually sort of what I did naturally as a little girl. I was always having a conversation with Jesus, about the most mundane things. And later on, I came back to that. It came full circle, but that wasn't taught to me necessarily in church. That was more like a God that could get very angry. It was sort of a policeman, an authority figure. And Jesus was the nice one. And God, at least this wasn't necessarily what was taught in a catechism, but it was what was caught by me, and authority figures that presented either the Bible this way or with their own lives sort of presented theology in this manner.
Mm-hmm. So before we hop into your book and The Wild Land Within, I'm curious how did you rediscover then the contemplative life as like a thing, because as you said, a lot of us find that sense of wonder and connectedness and all of that as children, but sometimes we have to come kind of around the long way to discover it as a practice as adults.
Yeah, and unlearning and deconstruction or unlearning. And, I would say I deconstructed everything, maybe became an atheist of every possible God. And that process of becoming an atheist or getting rid of all the idols, maybe is a better way to say it, is a process I hope I don't ever stop doing, because whatever conception of God I will wind up constructing to make myself feel better, hopefully that should get burst open and unfold into something bigger and more unknown. I would say always had been, we were a family that went to church 3 or 4 times a week as growing up. And I went to church camp. I loved going away to church camp and having really close friends there, and was a camp counselor, and went to, in college, went to like the Christian Fellowship and met my husband there. So it was really closely tied with the Christian community. But Christian people, I would say, were really disappointing. And Christian leadership and things like that, I didn't feel matched that. And I'm sure that reflected some of my own hypocrisy. I'm not going to say I was this, just this perfect Christian all the time and everybody else was just terrible. But I think what unfolded it for me was I went to seminary when I was about 35 and really was getting to know some of the desert elders, the mothers and fathers, the abbas and the ammas, and really learning church history, not just what came along with the Protestant Reformation, but what was deeply Christian, and even Eastern Orthodox, things like that, that wasn't on my radar at all. And I thought about, and I definitely talk about this in the book, about the difference between this Western imposition with the Roman Empire and Western ways of thinking. It's various spheres, like we have our work life, our friend life, our spiritual life, and it's all segmented. And then the Eastern way of thinking, which is a Jewish way of thinking as well, is our whole selves, our whole souls. Everything is spiritual, and there's no natural dissection of that, because we're whole people and we holistically heal or become injured. And so I was really, really drawn to that as I learned about some of the history of Christianity, and I delved into other spiritualities that were similar, like the Sufis, out of Islam. The Sufis have a mystic tradition. It's really interesting. And the poetry out of the Sufi tradition, you would mistake it for Psalms sometimes. You could mistake it for poetry, Christian poetry, because it sees God in a mysterious way, in a way where it's just pure love to God, pure devotion. It doesn't get into specifics. And it really opened up a whole new world for me that I dove into much beyond seminary too, much beyond my required reading. I really dove in and haven't turned back since.
Yeah. How did you discover that it's kind of this modern, I hesitate to call it a movement, but at least rebirth?
Yeah. It's always been there. It's always been a very strong stream within Christianity, but not necessarily in America, modern America. That is really, we have a culture that's born out of the Enlightenment. So it's very much like, we better prove Christianity. Here's a case for Christ. Here's the evidence. And that's really, we're sort of caught in our culture in a moment in time. It's a very recent modern moment, because we're a very young country. But this tradition in spirituality in general, and of course in Christianity, is very widespread in other parts of the world. It's just not widespread in modern American white culture. But actually, we're a minority. I mean, we don't tend to think of this in the United States, but we're a very strange, weird minority in the world and in human history. Extremely rare. To have enough money to buy something like a book, to have the education to read a book, to not have the imposition of a crumbling government or something falling around you. And that is awfully strange in human history. And so the spiritualities of you would say maybe non-white Americans in other parts of the world are much more tending towards this kind of spirituality. It's more normal. It's just not normal for us.
Yes. Okay. So I want to talk about like 16 different things here. But before I ask you about non-white spiritualities, I want to hear a little bit about the birth of this book. Like, how was it conceived and how did it come about?
Yeah. It had been on my mind for a long time. Even when I was in seminary back in 2009, I was like, I want to write a spiritual formation book, something that would have helped me, something that includes a lot of aspects that I don't see in other spiritual formation books, and especially something that I ran into very personally, which was, as I had a spiritual director and I was, praying different kinds of new prayers that were kind of opening me up to very rich encounters with God, feeling God's presence in a new way, or something along those lines. I was intrigued, because something like Lectio Divina, praying with scripture, was just this beautiful experience. And then something else I thought would be equally wonderful brought up pain and hurt and feelings of abandonment, feelings of resentment. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? There must be something wrong with me. Like, what's going on? I brought it up to my director. I felt like these prayer practices were certainly having a kind of a really negative effect. And she says to me, no, that's what's supposed to happen. And nobody told me this. No book told me this, that if it brings up tougher things, it means that's ready for healing and you're ready to look at it. It's part of the practice, bringing up what needs to be brought up into the light. God knows it's there, but you probably don't know it's there. And so now you can actually look at it, and the practice will bring up what needs to be brought up. It's not always going to be cupcakes and sprinkles. There's probably stuff there that will be reflected to you with the help and the ministry of the Holy Spirit. So she helped me work through those things. And I thought, I'm not getting this message from some of these books. Like, hey, it'll say, pray the hours, like maybe pray at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6. But no one's saying, oh, and by the way, maybe as you're doing that, you'll be overcome with a betrayal. Feel super disappointed and wonder what's going on. I don't read that part. So I was like, I want to accompany people through some of that. And what do you do when some of that comes up? Because personally, I've had a lot of trauma, and it was rough growing up. There were things that needed to be healed and in my heart, and trauma that needed to be healed as well. And I wanted people to understand that that's normal. Just because it's not like coming into close relationship with God means poof, your life is better and you should be smiling and cheerful and joyful and you've arrived and you're done. If that's not happening, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. It's just that you've been through some stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would almost argue that like people who feel like poof, they're happy is probably in denial.
It's probably coming. Yeah. It's probably going to come later or something like that. Like if you haven't dealt with your things, you'll probably get that opportunity at some point.
Yeah. At some point in your life. And I really love how you bring all of this up. One of my favorite intersections is between like neuroscience and trauma and all of that, and where it intersects with the spiritual life, because I agree. I think that's such a gap, especially in contemplative circles. I don't know if you know my background. I was in a convent for a while, and that was just the like psycho-emotional maturity was not really something that we talked about explicitly. And that had to go through my own falling apart for me to recognize like, oh, okay, so I can pray for like 4 hours a day, but if I don't have this like psycho-emotional maturity paralleling my spiritual growth, I'm going to get stunted. Like I just can't go as far because like, I think the whole goal of spiritual practices throughout the ages is really helping our entire selves, but especially our bodies, our nervous systems, to feel safe enough to open to the sacred. Absolutely. And that definitely intersects with those traumas that you're mentioning, the pain, the fears and anxiety. Sometimes we don't have words for them. We just like, why am I just feeling so off? It's like, no wonder it's hard for a lot of folks to meditate. They're like, I'm trying to do my 20-minute sits, but I just can't get myself to do them. And I was like, maybe your body's telling you something.
Exactly. And I think when we look at even just the ministry of Jesus, he picked out people that had issues, and he was there with presence for them, and he was there with love for them. So people who had really troubled pasts, he wasn't going, hey, you know what? Let's just do a lot of prayer, and that's going to kind of make you like me. He was just living with them, and kind of they were feeling safe and loved and accepted. They were regulating themselves to his non-anxious presence for those years, right? So they were getting used to feeling, what does it feel like to be safe and loved, even when I'm messing up, and just by being with him, they were starting to be changed. They still didn't make all those connections that would have been nice for them to make. We see them making mistakes, but just him being him and being like, you know what, you're fine here. Imagine like prostitutes who, God knows what these poor women had to go through and how they were treated and how they were obviously objectified, and sex was a transactional thing. And then Jesus is like, you're just wonderful to me. Just let's just spend time together.
Yeah.
How like mind blowing that would be. And they could actually feel safe in their bodies with someone who didn't want anything from them, just wanted to be with them.
That's so powerful. Just the notion that we're wounded in relationships and we are healed in relationships, and that co-regulation that you're talking about, I've never really reflected upon how that would have been to co-regulate with Jesus, but that's such a lovely thing, because I think any of us who have met like a deeply grounded or wise or holy person, whatever language we would use to describe that, there's something that we sense in our bodies when we're in somebody's presence like that, like,
Yes.
oh, I mean, and the flip
Yeah.
side, right? If somebody's like
Yeah.
really anxious and worked up, like we're just kind of all of those mirror neurons and, everything else in our nervous system is like, oh, maybe I'm supposed to be like that too.
That's really well
So
said. That's well said. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, absolutely.
And a book isn't going to necessarily teach us that embodied part.
Mm,
So like you can explain it in a book, but that's why it's great to have a director or a spiritual friend to co-regulate, like you're saying. It's
yeah,
not just going to be found just in a book or someone telling you, hey, go pray and read your Bible, but like you have to walk with somebody. It
yeah.
really is important. Or to have community, not just do something solo, like do a spiritual enterprise project solo, is that it's not going to really work to mature you on the inside into the character of Christ. You could be checking off the boxes that you're doing the things, but you're not going to really be able to mature, because again, the safety thing, you'll hit a wall at some point, and that's it.
I think that's such an important point too, for those of us who love learning, and love hanging out in that head space, which can be a
Yes.
wonderful thing. But, it's like I devour books and podcasts, and it almost
Yes.
makes us feel like we're doing the work just because the information is constantly flowing in. We're hearing stuff about it all the time. But to actually do the hard work in relationships of, how you speak to your partner during the day, or how many times a day you end up losing your patience, like, oh, what's that about? Like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe my body's telling me something. And I'm curious, especially as when those things come up in prayer or spiritual practice, how do you guide people? Like, what do you recommend people do when they start to notice that?
Well, it's again a practice, so you're gonna have to not stop doing it. You're gonna continue in it, and again, I do recommend a spiritual friend or a director who has been trained to listen and not put their stuff on your stuff, project their stuff, or start to, if you're talking to a spiritual director and it becomes about their stories or how they did it, that means they're not good at listening. And being good at listening, again, you have to be sort of naturally good at it, but you really have to be trained. And if someone can hold sacred space for you, you can begin to sit with the feelings that you have properly and not freak out about them or push them down. Because the first thing you're going to want to do is the automatic thing that all of us do. People don't like pain, emotional pain, or any other kind usually, unless it's kind of on their terms. Like, okay, I'll take another tattoo.
Yeah.
But it's like, they'll do that instead. They'll pick like the tough, they'll pick a certain kind of pain over another kind of pain. And so what we'll do instead is we'll escape. Maybe that's going on social media, maybe that's some kind of drug or plant medicine, whatever. We will do something to escape, push it down, look the other way, and be distracted. And we'll do that without even knowing it. And we'll do it consciously too, so that we have to realize that that's going to be our instinct, and we'll have to be almost looking for, oh, how am I also trying to push this away? So you're getting used to feeling it. You're realizing what are the ways I'm also trying to not feel this or experience it, and sitting through it. And because it takes time, it's a lot of people can't seem to get through it for a long time without help. And that could be a trauma-informed therapist that's a good match. Again, I just think people need to do this in community that they can trust. But feeling the feelings and being okay feeling feelings and feeling it all the way through, that every part of feeling that is okay, and you're normal. Like, this is normal to feel bad. Like, just because we feel bad, and I'm not talking like really deep depression where you feel like life's not worth living for more than like 2 weeks, something, but you can feel awful, and that is part of the natural human ups and downs. I think we've been sold a lot of things from commercials and stuff, that the happy, positive feelings are the feelings we're supposed to have, and that everything else is abnormal or pathological. I don't think that's true. It's just that it's unpleasant. So as we're feeling those tougher things, we're working it all the way out to the end. I don't have advice like that is pleasant advice for people when those feelings come up, because it's just something that you have to get used to feeling, and sort of talking yourself through, like, okay, that's coming up. Maybe you want to journal it out just to get it off your mind. Some of the practices help with that. But again, the practices are not silver bullets that get rid of things. They just bring the things up so that they're out in the open instead of hiding in the shadows. Yeah, I wish there was a nice, great answer to give you, but it's like doing the work. When you feel the things, do the work.
Yes. And I like the emphasis both on community, but also a trained practitioner of some sort, because, as we were saying, that sense of co-regulation gives us at least the goal of that, especially when you're working with a guide, is to have like a safe container. Or when my life was falling apart, I felt like it was, somebody kind of like holding the rope as I was like being lowered into this well to do this deep, dark work. I'm like, if something goes wrong, you got to pull me out. Okay. But it's so much easier for your insides to feel safe feeling those feelings when there's somebody else there kind of holding the rope and saying like, hey, I can be here. We can talk through this, maybe hold you if you need, or, whatever it is, whatever feels most.
And to your point, it's kind of like no one can go down that place for you, but someone can say, hey, there's a handhold just a little to your right. Okay. And then there's a foothold just up to your left. They can a little bit, but they can't do that for you.
Right.
But they maybe have been there, or they can see it a little from a different perspective. And I know it's hard to just go to someone and feel vulnerable, but it's not like you have to spill your guts in every single session or something. Usually a director just deals with that one thing that's happening right then. They don't dig. Spiritual directors aren't therapists. And that's a really important thing. They're not going to dig in your past and be like, well, what are your feelings about your mom? They're just going to deal with the thing that's right there. And it's a different experience than getting like psychotherapy, which can be very important, but it's just different. The focus is very different.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to ask too, I know something you brought up in your book was the importance of community and how non-Western spiritualities tend to embrace that a little bit better than the white kind of Protestant American ethic. And I'm curious what other kinds of gifts you see non-white spiritualities, whether it's Native American or African or even Eastern Orthodox. I love that too. What kind of gifts they bring us, and really what we're missing out on if we don't include all of those.
Well, I'd like to start with the framework that we have. If people listening to us consider themselves white or white passing in the United States, or in a somewhat privileged, abundant country. That is a culture. And it is a culture that is not an ethnicity so much as it is a position of power and privilege. And that isn't a disparaging comment. It's just kind of the facts. So the gospel is, from that perspective, is always done in a kind of, from a powerful way, from a point of empire. That isn't the gospel of Jesus. It is a gospel that we've come to, or is a Christianity, and a version or a strain of Christianity that's come along in the years since Jesus. Jesus came in poverty. Jesus came as the underdog. Jesus came as the marginalized. Jesus came as a person from an occupied country. And so the gospel comes from the margins and is for people on the margins. So when we can't hear those voices, and we don't think, you have to sometimes take what seems like extraordinary measures to hear from people who don't look like you. But if you don't take any of those measures, you're actually not hearing the gospel. It's brought to us from the margins. And so we kind of get it backwards. That's why reading, and I have some of this in the book, what liberation theology is, coming from Peru, and the people who are incredibly oppressed, and that means their lives are shortened. That means that poverty, hunger, oppression shortens their actual lives. And what does spirituality look like for them? How does it look like for them? And what Gustavo Gutierrez talks about is that he says that God has a preferential consideration for the poor. And that means his heart has a soft spot, which is why Jesus came the way Jesus came, as who he came as. Because when God thought, who should I come as? How about a powerful king? That would make a big impression. That could do a lot. I could have a lot of power, just make edicts about things. God comes as powerless. So when our Christianity and our formation is formed by a powerful country doing missionary work out towards the marginalized, we also come in and we colonize our Christianity into other countries. It is a very different spirituality than when it comes from the other side. So if we're not aware that our culture and our abundance and our privilege is tainting our formation, we have to really wake up to that and make an extreme effort, I would say. If we don't make a real extreme effort to hear from other voices that are considered non-white, and then just non-white, however, Asian, Indigenous, Black, from other parts of the world, especially, just diversify. And it's easy to look them up. It's easy to find these lists, but it's not doing due diligence unless that is really part of our libraries. It's part of the books we read, the podcasts we listen to. It's really negligence when we don't do that. If we're considering how do we want to be like Christ? Christ was not a privileged person. So God's heart is for the poor. It means that it's for the people who are the most mistreated, the most unjustly treated, the least likely to have a good life. But a lot of times we don't understand that because we have such an abundant life. We have, we understand what we can to the best of our ability within our abundance, but it is incredibly, it's like having blinders on. And so it's just to say that, and this has been my experience completely. My dad was brown, Puerto Rican man, converted to a white Christianity that was white Southern Baptist, fundamentalist. And so the whiter he seemed, the whiter culturally he seemed, the more sanctified and saved he seemed. So he would be trying to convert people not just to Christianity, but to whiteness, away from the culture of music and dance, away from the Puerto Rican culture, which is saturated in all these things. And not to say the Puerto Rican culture is pure and has no problems, but the less Puerto Rican he seemed, the better he was doing. And what it did is erasure, total erasure, as if God isn't somehow working within cultures themselves. It doesn't have, you don't have to erase a culture for God to redeem it. It can be redeemed right within its own beautiful self. And so I think it's just really important to see how power and privilege will force assimilation. It will squeeze out the beauty of people who live and learn and are different than us. And I think it's just these are image bearers of God that are, non-white image bearers of God that sometimes in our perverse way of thinking, how people should convert to Christianity should look a certain way, it should sound a certain way, and it's a devastating thing, and it's very, in my opinion, it's extremely disrespectful to the image of God. It's like saying, saying to God, no, the image of God looks like this, like me, like how we do it. It's absurd, really,
Yeah. And it makes me think of just how complicated, at the very least, missionary work is, and as we're kind of waking up to, like,
yeah, maybe that wasn't the best. Some of those decisions weren't some of the best.
Right. Just coming in not only with like whiteness, but as if like, I know what it means to be a Christian, instead of like, how can I go and discover Christ, God, the sacred, whatever, already at work within these people? And how do I learn from them, because
Yeah.
that idea of like the preferential option for the poor, like that God really has a soft spot there. And also, I mean, even just saying that, how much my body kind of relaxes, like, oh, we don't have to try quite so hard to be, this image that I don't know, like one of my Mormon neighbors was saying, like, oh yeah, for Mormons, like image is everything. There is more like plastic surgery and more, like
Oh my goodness.
whatever amongst Mormons, because there is this almost prosperity gospel kind of sense of like, the more you have it together, if you have the perfect life, look beautiful, or Botox or whatever, that clearly means, you have God's favor, instead of like, oh no, God's in the mess, man. Like, He's with the powerless.
Right, exactly. And the disabled and the disfigured, and it's very interesting to think that a lot of impositions that happen with certain kinds of missionary impulse, I would say, it's well intended in a way. We don't want people to go to hell, but it's also like, do you really think in your heart of hearts that God has not been somehow at work wherever God wants to be at work, is not just in your little sphere? And like, to your point, that God is working within a culture. There's always some people in a culture that sort of have the light. They're light bearers in some regard. And the culture might have become perverse, and our culture might have become very perverse. But there's usually people who are a little bit awakened by the Holy Spirit to sense, because as Paul says, we can see God right in nature. Nature is translucent with God, and you can look and you can see the greater things at work, and God is not far off. God is like in and through all things. There are people sensitive to it in every culture, and to go in and be like, yeah, you've been doing it wrong. You don't get it. God looks like this. And now you have to sing songs like this. Don't move your body around because that's dirty. Don't do, it's just like, it's pretty unbelievable, but it also is about ableism as well. So it's like so what if you don't have the cognition to confess and believe? If you ask people that, they usually say, and I have a son who has great intellectual difficulty. So this changed some of my theology too, because they would say, well, there's a special dispensation of grace for people who might not. So that special dispensation of grace doesn't count except for in this case. Otherwise, you have to confess and believe. It's just an interesting thing how grace works, and for God it's very simple. You get grace. For people it's like, well, there's this thing and then there's this other thing, and make sure you're doing this. It's like it might
filling out an IRS form or something, like make sure you put everything in the right spot.
It might be easier than you think, and that's the scandal itself. Like, if you love God, you will be loved by God, and you're loved by God anyway. But if you love God, you don't stand a chance to be forsaken by God, or you're not going to like miss a little thing and be like, oh no, I'm in hell. What did I do wrong? Like, it just doesn't work like that. People might be like that. Like, you forgot to cross a T and you forgot to dot an I. Sorry, your insurance isn't going to work now. But God is so lavish and so abundant and so almost to a point of being ridiculous. You can't get away from God's love, and so it's like, if we really do that, then we act like that too. If we really think that God is like that, we begin to act like that too. That we have enough to give, we have enough patience, we have enough love to give. If that's the God that we want to be like and we're worshiping.
Yes, the lavishness of God is what is sticking in my heart, just how much the outpouring is already there. And that is why these spiritual practices are just meant to help us make room for it. It's like already present, pressing in, like, I just want to pour out. Can you make space for all of this that I want to give? And I'm wondering, so you've mentioned a couple of times like Eastern or Eastern Orthodox, and I'm curious, how that tradition
Mhm.
has really helped preserve some of this, or how it helps highlight some of this, or if it does, maybe I'm sure it depends on its expression and who you're
Mhm.
talking to. Just like any Christian, you can get a million different flavors of Christianity. But
Yeah.
what's special about Eastern Orthodox Christianity versus the West?
Well, it's good to remember that Eastern Orthodox is the first Christianity. It's where things started. We're talking about Syria and Turkey, and
Mm.
we're talking about the places where Paul first went. And when the schism happened in 1000 AD. We think of the Protestant Reformation a lot of times in America. That's the big breakup. It's like the big breakup happened in 1000 AD, East and West, and they wanted a pope in Rome in the West, and the East was like, no. And there were fights before then, of course, but the East wasn't about like centralizing power in Rome. It's not to say the East has it all together and the West doesn't. What I wanted to do was just take what's from the East and join it with what's from the West, because sometimes you just completely forget about it. But the Eastern Coptic Church, the Coptics are Egyptian Christians. They're like the earliest ones. Like they trace their start back to Mark in 80 AD.
Mm-hmm.
That's who founded their church.
Yeah.
That's like they have like his picture up, like his like that they drew from looking at him. You know what I mean? So they have this tradition that just goes all the way back to the apostolic period. And again, it's embodied, it's more liturgical. They use, and this is fascinating too, if we can ever get a chance to do this, they have their stuff in Aramaic.
Mm.
This is the language Jesus spoke. Aramaic was just considered this, too common of a language, is kind of looked down upon. You should write it in Greek. So we have, more of what people would have been speaking like when out of that tradition. It's just a great way to maybe connect more with the spirit of the actual apostles and the mindset of the earliest Christians in their way of making everything one whole spirituality, instead of the Western mindset. Again, is more like, I think I was mentioning, it's a little more disconnected culturally. It can be seen as sort of the mind and the body, or the spirit, the body and the spirit, and these ideas like that there are somehow two parts of us, or more than one part of us.
Mm-hmm.
Eastern way of thinking is that you cannot actually separate into pieces ourselves. And there's many other things, but I think the imposition of empire and the ideas of crime and punishment. How does an empire deal with sin? Well, with punishment. But in Eastern Orthodox, what I learned from Evagrius Ponticus, I have in my book too, he isn't talking about sin as a transgression that you punish. He talks about prevention. He's like a physician, and he talks about it like, okay, here's some things that are going to come your way. They are sin, and they're going to throw you off. But what we're going to do is we're going to know what they are. We're going to see them coming. And as soon as you sin, turn around. Don't do it. Repent. Western is more like, you did a crime. You committed a crime. You're going to go through a tribunal. You're going to be considered obviously guilty. Then you're going to do some penance. You're going to, and it's very court-like. It's very, this is an imposition, a cultural imposition of the West. It's not to say that sin isn't wrong. Of course it is. And it keeps us stunted and hindered and ruins our relationships and makes us feel distant from God. But God is, of course, in us and with us at all times. But we can put up our little barriers and be like, I feel bad about what I did. But Evagrius is like this tender spiritual guide. And he really, as I talk about in the book, he takes his students who came to him for guidance and wisdom, and he just kind of says, let's walk through this together. We're not going to treat sin like something you have to be like, oh, I sinned, I better hide this, or I'm not sure what I should do. He's like, of course you're going to sin. Of course, we're out here in the desert, and you used to have this full life back in the city. so when you come out here, stuff's going to happen. So let's just talk about it and be real. And when it happens, you're going to turn around and we can talk about it. So it was like this kind of companionship all through life, not just when things got bad. And I like his approach much better. It's much more healing. He talks about these cracks in the heart. That's why we sin. We don't sin because we're disgusting worms that God is looking at like, ugh, I guess I'll save you. He says we sin because we're vulnerable. We have these cracks in the heart. We're vulnerable human beings. We will make mistakes. And then God embraces us and loves us. So we turn back around and we begin again. And I love his teaching method. He's much more like a teacher instead of a judge. And in Empire Christianity, that was much more, based in Roman Empire stuff, you get much more of God as a judge and the court system. And, even if you take your own life, it's called what? Committing suicide, a crime. It's a crime. If you take your own life, what's actually happening? Something horrendous, like you've had a breakdown to the point where you have decided it's not even worth it to live. Is that a crime, or is that just like the most the saddest thing you've ever heard? Something that needs care, something that needs deep soul care. Or should you just be punished like you're a criminal? It's like, to me, as you learn the Eastern way of the fathers and the mothers of the desert, who would walk it with guides through people's lives, their whole lives, not just when things get crazy. But that is the way we mature. To me, that is the way we mature. We don't just kind of wing it and look like we're doing a good job, and then we get punished when we do something wrong, and then we begin to have either a double life or hide it, or act sanctimonious when we start getting it right because everybody else is not doing it as good as I am, but I'm doing it. It's just a really practical way of going through life and being very honest. Of course, we're going to sin. Here's the 8 ways. He talks about 8 ways, and you'll have certain vulnerabilities towards some of them. And he's just very like, here's how it works.
Yeah.
And we know this. So, all right. No, we don't have to be like, yes, I have this sin. He's like, yeah, lust might be one of them. Greed might be another one. Anger might be another one. Here's how it works. Here's how it's coming. So in my book, I talk about how these are almost work like weather systems coming in. You might be tempted, say, by anger, and it'll work in this sort of way, but it doesn't stay with us. It kind of works its way through. So it's not going to just be there. And if you learn, like, just like you would for preparing for weather, what happens when a storm's coming through? Should you maybe put your windows down? Should you pull stuff inside that might blow away? Should you, wear something different if you're going to be outside? It's like that. So you prepare, interiorly for these things, and what's coming. And I like that mindset instead of maybe even a warrior mindset of Empire, is kind of like, we are fighting this fight against, and it's like, that's not going to be as helpful as just the practicalness of thinking stuff's going to come up.
Right. There's so much more ease with that. Like,
we're gonna when it comes up, we're not going to be surprised, and we're not going to be horrified. And we're, again, non-anxious presence. Yes, if we don't want to be going along in these ways that are unhealthy for us in our relationships, of course not. But we're not going to get crazy and be like, you dirty, sickening sinner. We're just going to be like, honest. Yes, that was a mess up. That was a screw up. That's not healthy. I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to turn around as quickly as I possibly can. I'm not going to hide it, and move on. And I think it's a loving way. I think Jesus would have been more like that. I don't think Jesus has been like, all right, step up to the court. Now we're gonna dole out some penance for you. And I think he would have just been like, stop it. Okay, let's move on. What's for dinner? It would have been like that.
Yes. I think our image of God almost always has more to do with us than it does to actually have to do with God. And I love that you said at the beginning, like, I hope I continue to be, if not like this, regular atheist, if you will, at least someone who is continually knocking down idols, because all the mystics tell
Mhm.
us that as well. Like, if you think you've understood God, it's not God you've understood. Like,
Right.
always bigger than you can imagine,
Exactly.
and that's something I think that helps us settle into that non-duality that we find in more Eastern religions, whether it is like Eastern Orthodox, like the Eastern form of Christianity, or,
Mhm.
if you look at Buddhism or like some other expressions,
Mhm.
the further east that you go, like, oh,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe I don't need to like strap on all my armor and get ready, like as if it's this like huge thing that we have to do. Like, no, as we were saying before, it's more about powerlessness. It's the vulnerability. Like, how do I
Mm.
accept those places of myself that are
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
little bit scary, that that I'm weak? I mean, I think that's really what spiritual poverty is all about, like
Mm.
recognizing our own powerlessness and being
Mhm.
able to make space for
Mhm.
grace, beauty, love, whatever you want to
Right.
call it.
Right. Well, it's
So,
interesting just to speak to the point for a second about the armor. It's really
mm,
interesting because if you're putting on armor, the armor would be to protect you against an outside threat, right? But the inside, how would you put on armor to protect you against yourself, right? So it doesn't work then. It would
mm,
work if you had somebody who was going to be a threat to you. Like when Paul talks about the armor, we get that all mixed up when we speak about
mm,
it later, because we're trying to protect ourselves from ourselves with armor a
mm,
lot of times, right? And it's an inside job.
mhm,
So the less armor we have in those cases, like we need God to pierce us through,
mm,
uh, and no armor,
mhm,
just do it.
mhm.
Just do it and do the surgery that needs to happen, because my armor isn't helping me at all, in this case.
Yeah.
And so with healing and spiritual maturity and formation and growth, it's not time for armor,
Mm,
and armor might be good in the case of maybe battling outside temptations or something like that. But I feel like that Paul enjoyed warrior motifs, and boy, do we relish them and we love them. But if you realize who Paul was compared to who Jesus was,
mm,
Paul was a Roman citizen.
mhm,
Paul had enough money, that his family had enough money that he could buy his Roman citizenship. Paul was skilled in a trade, and he was completely educated in all sorts of ways. He was a man of privilege.
mm,
And Jesus wasn't. Like, they were really opposites. So
mm,
his point of view, not to say that he was wrong, but their points of view were very different. Jesus didn't have the kind of money to buy citizenship. Like that would have been out of the question. So when
mhm.
he speaks about armor, he has much more of an empire mentality to him.
Yeah.
Those flavorings for us in Empire now, American Empire, we're like, ooh, I love those warrior motifs. We're like lapping them up. But I think we're missing his point, that he's not talking about warring in the same sorts of ways. Paul makes himself very vulnerable.
Mm,
And we miss those pieces because we like feeling strong and we like feeling
mm,
powerful. But in fact, we're trying to not be like Paul and have privilege like he had as a Roman citizen. We're trying to be like the powerless
mm.
Jesus, who gives his life up for his friends,
Yes.
who takes on no reputation, and becomes like a servant. So it's like, let's not follow Paul in these cases. Let's follow the savior servant,
Yeah. It's so upside down, right? Like, it's just like, wouldn't it be easier to, be strong and powerful and I've got all my defenses, versus going into vulnerable places and being soft and tender? Like, there are parts of us that are terrified of that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
it
yeah,
it makes a lot of
truly.
sense why we try to glob on to, whether it is specifically kind of those kind of battle warrior motifs, or just the more capitalistic, like, achievement things. Like I gotta do my personal salvation project, you know, I gotta do my 20-minute sit every day, and then I gotta like go do my social justice, and you know, like you have to check off all the things instead of like, oh, well, what am I really being called to in this moment? And it might be in very simple, quiet ways.
It could be very tiny ways. And are we okay with that? God's okay with it, but are we okay not looking that productive to ourselves and to other people? Like, oh, hey, what'd you do today? Well, not much. You know, was that enough? Like, was that enough for us? You know, to God, if our spirit is turned towards God and turned towards others, especially others who have been left out of the empire.
Yeah.
It's plenty. It's plenty.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, we don't have to buy into empire. But that's what we will do if we're part of a country like the United States or some other country. We're automatically on default part of empire, period. If we look white and white passing, we can't help it. That's part of how we move in the world. So to get out of that mentality, we have to who is our Lord? Is Jesus, who is crushed by empire. He was assassinated by the empire. And it's, you know, it's really, we're not the same. You know, we have to realize that the person we say we follow and we want to be like, if we're Christians, was absolutely mowed over by the empire, because he was a man of no reputation. He had absolutely no political or royal power, no money, he couldn't pay his way out, you know, no clerical power of like a Pharisee or Sadducee who could pull strings. Zip. Like he healed people, and that got him some, and he, you know, provided food. So he was definitely popular sometimes, but that's it really.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So as we're drawing to a close today, I'm curious, what advice you would give people to feel at home in this spiritual wilderness, because it can be kind of I was going to say scary place, not just scary. It just feels intimidating, you know, like I sometimes use the analogy of feeling like we grew up in spiritual suburbia, you know, where it's like white picket fences, like, you know, exactly like what color schemes are allowed for your paint colors. You know, everything and what's in, what's out. And then you dropped into the middle of the Yukon territory that is stunningly beautiful, but also you have like no idea how to survive out there, you know? So like, what survival skills would you leave with people or invite them to explore in order to feel more at home in those spiritual wildernesses?
I love your question. I think the reason why I called the book The Wild Land Within is only because this is territory we're unfamiliar with. And that we can become familiar with it, and we're never alone in doing that, because God, it's not unfamiliar territory to God. It's just unfamiliar to us. And that God resides. I mean, I learned about this kernel from Howard Thurman. You know, read everything you can by Howard Thurman. Also with Thomas Merton. He talks about this inner kernel that can never be taken away. That's the real part of us that is united with God, that is in the center. And when we settle down into that center where God is, that's where we have the peace that passes all understanding. No matter if we're in an urban jungle at a business meeting, or if we're kind of feeling alone in some kind of quandary, or we're exploring our inner life for the first time and finding out maybe we have more work and more hangups and more bitterness or trauma than we realized. And it seems all crazy in a jumble, and what am I going to do? But in the still center is where we can settle down, as Howard Thurman calls it, centering down to that still center. That's not a place of privilege. That's a place that we all have because we're human beings. So we're all able to go there, even for a moment while you're washing your hands before a meal or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's available. And so you're not alone because God is closer than your very breath. It's a matter of going back there and going back there and going back there. That you become familiar with your own company.
Mm.
And that company is always shared with God. And when God feels far away or when you feel disconnected, I believe that it's because that is a reflection of your own disconnection from yourself.
Mm.
So that is the thing that we have to realize, that we are feeling unfamiliar with and disconnected from ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is that this universe, or how we find ourselves existing, doesn't work without a center, without God, with whatever we call God.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work without that. It doesn't, like, we're here because of a source. That source is love. And love means a lot. Love means it's holding everything together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people who've had mystical experiences might understand what I mean. This is like a wink towards you, like, what I mean. It's love that's holding everything together, right?
Yeah.
But living that out and not feeling the tumultuous twists and turns of our inner world can be really hard. So we have to return back to that living water, that inner kernel, and go back, even when we feel like it's not working, because that still center is that only place of presence and stillness. Again, this is a contemplative mentality I have, and I'm suggesting doing something contemplative. I'm not suggesting doing something like that's necessarily outward, although it can have an expression of outwardness. You can sing as well. You can draw or dance or do anything else as an expression as well, but that it begins there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love that. The kernel, the center that you draw back to, the image that comes to mind is just like settling down underneath the ocean waves that might be thrashing on top, but settle and find the anchor, like way deep down in the bottom.
Right.
Find where that is. And
Mm-hmm.
even though you might not, it takes quite a bit of practice to try to live from there. I feel like even the most saintly, whatever, gurus or wise people might live there maybe the majority of the time, but I don't think anybody lives there 100% of the time, because we're human and it's normal to have thrashing about. And
especially if you have any kind of typical life where you have obligations or children or things going on. If you're cloistered away, maybe, but I know that even if you're cloistered away, that's when the demons come out, they say, when you have all your thoughts to yourself. But yeah, it's not possible to live there all the time, especially not without probably years of practice. So if it doesn't seem natural or normal, that means you're normal. But as you practice it, you develop a taste for it and a skill, and like a muscle. And it changes you. So I'm not the same that I was 5 years ago, or years ago, when what I'm speaking of didn't make any sense to me. And it's not the typical, what I'm talking about is essentially prayer, but it's not asking God for things. It's just being okay with knowing I'm with God in every moment. It is a kind of prayer of the heart.
Absolutely, which is a great cue up for Carmen Acevedo Butcher's session on practice of the presence. That's wonderful.
Such a good translation. Yeah, I'm so excited that she's also another guest, because that is a book I'm reading now. It's really, really touching me. Really so good.
So beautiful. Lisa, this has been just delightful. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. If people want to learn more about your work and what you do, where should they go?
Come to my website, lisadelay.com, or sparkmymuse.com. My book is The Wild Land Within. And I would love to be in touch talking. I do some spiritual companioning, but I also do a podcast every Wednesday, usually reading and reflecting, or sometimes I'll have a guest on. And I could use the support with the books, because I'd like to put in another book that goes deeper into some of the things that I've talked about and delve deeper. But this one has to sell a lot more copies first.
I understand that. I highly recommend Lisa's book. We'll definitely leave some links in the notes here for everyone to check that out. But Lisa, I so appreciate you sharing some of your wisdom and experience with us today, and I appreciate everyone for joining us as well. So thank you so much.